Did you know Adolf Hitler was officially stateless for years and only became a German citizen in 1932? Then, in less than a year, he was inside the system and closer to power than most people ever get in a lifetime. So here's the scary question. Who opened the door for him? And what happened in that short window before anyone could stop it? Picture this. It's a normal evening in Germany. People are walking home, shops are closing, families are trying to make dinner with whatever they can afford. Nothing looks like a movie, nothing looks like the start of something huge. And that's the scary part. A man stands outside a cafe, reading the same news headline again and again. Prices are rising, jobs are disappearing. The future feels like a door that keeps moving farther away. He folds the paper, shakes his head, and says the sentence you hear in countries that are losing hope. Someone needs to fix this. A few streets away, in a small hall, there's a meeting. Just a few people, not thousands, not an army. Just men in coats, tired faces, cheap chairs. It doesn't look important at all. But in that room, something is being tested. A speaker steps forward. He doesn't talk like a professor. He talks like a person who wants to win. He takes a complicated disaster and makes it simple. He points to a reason. He points to a target. He promises a solution. And you can feel the room change. Not because everyone suddenly becomes evil, because everyone suddenly feels relieved. For the first time in a long time, the chaos feels like it has a shape, like it has an explanation. Outside, nothing changes. The streets still look normal. People still go to work. Kids still sleep. Trains still run. But something has started. Now, here's the question that makes this story dangerous and why it matters even today. How does a man with no real power become a man a whole nation listens to? How does it happen step by step, in public, in a modern country, with laws, elections, newspapers, while millions of people believe they're making reasonable choices? That's what this video is about. Not a legend, not a myth, a real chain of events. Because the most shocking part of this story isn't the ending. It's how ordinary the beginning looks. So let's go back to the moment when Germany was desperate, and when one voice learned how to turn desperation into loyalty. Germany after World War I didn't feel like history. It felt like a hangover that never ended. In 1918, the war was over, but the damage kept moving through people's lives like a slow poison. Soldiers came home to cities that didn't know what to do with them. Families were missing fathers, brothers, sons. Streets were full, but the mood was empty. And then came the kind of ending that doesn't just hurt a country, it humiliates it. Germany didn't just lose. Many Germans felt betrayed, like the loss was something done to them, not something that happened. That feeling matters because humiliation doesn't sit quietly. It looks for a reason. It looks for someone to blame. Now add the political chaos. The old empire collapsed. A new government tried to stand up in its place, but it was fragile from the first day. Parties fought each other, streets filled with rallies, clashes, and anger from every direction. Some people wanted revolution, others wanted order at any cost. And in the middle, the average person just wanted a normal life again. But normal life was about to get much harder. The Treaty of Versailles landed like a heavy stone. Many Germans saw it as punishment written into law, territory lost, military restricted, and huge payments demanded. Whether you agree with the treaty or not, the emotional impact inside Germany was clear. It became a symbol, a daily reminder that the country was down, watched, and forced to pay. And when people feel trapped, they don't become thoughtful, they become desperate. Then the economy started doing something that sounds almost unreal if you haven't seen it. Money began to lose meaning. At first, it's small. Prices go up, people complain, they tighten their budgets, they hope it passes. Then, it doesn't pass. By the early 1920s, inflation in Germany was not just high, it was violent. Prices didn't rise monthly, they rose weekly, then daily, then sometimes within the same day. A salary could be decent in the morning and useless by the evening. Imagine working for years, saving carefully, doing everything the right way, and then waking up to discover your savings are basically paper. That does something to a society. Because when money becomes unreliable, trust collapses with it. People stop believing the future is stable. They stop believing the rules mean anything. They stop believing hard work protects you. And once that belief dies, people become easy to manipulate. There's a moment in this period that tells you everything. Families would rush to spend their pay the same day they received it, because waiting even a little meant losing value. Shops couldn't keep up with price changes. People carried bundles of cash like it was firewood. It wasn't wealth, it was panic. Now layer on another blow: foreign occupation and national pride. In 1923, when Germany fell behind on payments, French and Belgian forces occupied the Ruhr, the industrial heart of Germany. To many Germans, this felt like the country wasn't just punished, it was being controlled. Resentment deepened, anger sharpened. This is how a perfect storm forms: economic pain, political weakness, national humiliation, and daily anxiety. And here's the key point for your video. This storm didn't make everyone evil, it made people reachable. Reachable by anyone who could offer three things: a simple explanation, a clear enemy, a promise of control. That's when extremist groups thrive. Not because they're correct, because they're confident. Because they sound certain, while everyone else sounds confused. During these years, Germany wasn't just struggling, it was arguing with itself in public. The streets became political. Even ordinary conversations became dangerous. People stopped trusting neighbors. They started sorting each other into us and them. And then, just when the country seemed like it might stabilize, just when some people thought the nightmare was fading, another disaster arrived from outside: the Great Depression. After 1929, global markets crashed, and Germany, already fragile, took the hit hard. Businesses failed, credit dried up, unemployment surged. And when millions of people can't find work, the economy isn't the only thing that breaks. Dignity breaks. A person without work doesn't just lose income. They lose routine, status, confidence, and control over tomorrow. Families feel it. Neighborhoods feel it. Entire cities feel it. And when enough people feel powerless, they start craving a strong answer. At this point, the center couldn't hold. Moderate politicians looked weak because they couldn't stop the pain. Every election felt like a gamble. Governments rose and fell quickly. People got tired of debate. They wanted action. They wanted certainty. They wanted someone to say, "I can fix this," and sound like they meant it. And this is the moment you need to remember as we move forward. History didn't turn because Germany suddenly changed. History turned because conditions made a certain kind of message feel irresistible. A message that promised pride instead of shame, order instead of chaos, a future that didn't feel random anymore. And while most people were trying to survive, a small political movement was watching all of this like an opportunity. Because a desperate society is a society that can be steered. Now, before we follow how that movement grew, we have to understand the man who would become its voice, how he was shaped, what he learned from war and failure, and why his style of politics worked so well in a country that was emotionally exhausted. That's next. When I said Germany was emotionally exhausted, I meant something very specific. In a country like that, the most dangerous person isn't the smartest person in the room. It's the person who can turn pain into a simple story and make people feel like following him will finally bring order back. So before we track how that small movement grew, we need to understand how Hitler was shaped into the kind of person who could play that role. Not with myths, not with movie drama, with real details that explain the shift. Adolf Hitler was born in Austria in 1889. Long before politics, his life was unstable and unimpressive by normal standards. He wanted to be an artist. He applied to the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna and was rejected. He spent years drifting, low status, uncertain future, living on the edge of poverty. What matters here isn't the artist detail itself, it's the pattern. A person with ambition but no success, looking for a place where he could matter. Then he moved to Munich in 1913. A year later, World War I began, and this is where his identity changes in a way that becomes permanent. Hitler volunteered for the Bavarian Army in 1914. In the military, he finally got what his earlier life didn't give him: structure, belonging, and a clear role. He served as a messenger, often near frontline conditions. He was wounded in 1916 and later affected by gas near the end of the war in 1918, which temporarily impaired his vision. He received decorations including the Iron Cross, something he later used as proof that he was a serious war veteran. But the deeper impact wasn't medals, it was psychological. For someone who had been drifting, the war gave him a fixed identity. It gave him purpose. It gave him a feeling of being part of something bigger. That kind of meaning is addictive, especially for someone who felt invisible before. Then the war ended, suddenly, painfully, and for many Germans, humiliatingly. Germany's defeat didn't land like a normal loss. The empire collapsed, the country changed governments, street violence and political fighting grew, and people heard the constant message that Germany was being punished and controlled. In that climate, many veterans didn't just feel disappointed, they felt robbed. Hitler reacted to the defeat as a personal collapse. Later, he described 1918 as the moment his belief system hardened. He didn't interpret the end of the war as "we lost." He interpreted it as "we were betrayed." And this is where something important happens. He didn't come up with that idea alone. After the war, Hitler stayed in Munich and remained connected to the army. The military was terrified of revolution and chaos, and it began using soldiers in roles that included political observation and anti-revolution messaging. Hitler was put into that environment, listening to political lectures, being exposed to extremist talking points, learning to see politics as a battle of enemies and loyalty. In 1919, he was sent to observe a small group, the German Workers' Party. This wasn't some giant national force. It was a tiny room with angry men talking about Germany's humiliation, blaming enemies, promising national rebirth. And in that room, Hitler found the thing his life had been missing for years, a mission that matched his emotional state. He joined the party. And quickly it became clear why he mattered to them. He could speak in a way that turned chaos into certainty. He didn't sound like a politician debating policy. He sounded like someone delivering an answer. In a stable country, that kind of certainty is just noise. In an exhausted country, it feels like rescue. So, by the time Germany's crises deepened, Hitler wasn't just a random man with opinions. His identity had already shifted. War gave him belonging, defeat gave him obsession, and the post-war political chaos gave him an opening. Now we follow the next step, how that tiny movement stopped being a room and started becoming a force. At the start, it really was just a room, not a nation, not a government, not an army. A small political club in Munich where angry people complained about defeat, inflation, humiliation, and the feeling that Germany was being pushed around. But here's what made that room dangerous. It wasn't only a place to vent, it was a place where frustration was being shaped into a message. And Hitler quickly became the person shaping it. In 1920, the group rebranded itself. It stopped sounding like a local club and started sounding like a national answer. It became the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis, and it adopted symbols, slogans, and a simple identity people could recognize instantly. The goal wasn't subtle thinking. The goal was clarity. A movement has to feel easy to join. Hitler's job inside that movement wasn't policy, it was attention. He spoke with intensity and certainty, and in a crisis, certainty is magnetic. He didn't argue like a normal politician. He framed everything like a fight. Someone is to blame, someone is suffering, someone must take action. That style worked because Germany wasn't calm. Germany was exhausted. And exhausted people don't want complexity. They want a story that feels like control. Then came the first big upgrade that turned a club into a real movement. Propaganda as a system. They didn't just hold meetings, they staged events. They understood that crowds create emotion. Emotion creates belonging. Belonging creates loyalty. So they built a public image. Rallies, uniforms, marching, banners. Things that made supporters feel like they were part of something bigger than their own struggling life. And while speeches pulled people in, something else kept them there: intimidation. The party developed a paramilitary wing, the SA, often called brown shirts, used to protect events, fight opponents in the streets, and project strength. This matters because it changed the atmosphere around politics. When people are scared, they don't participate freely. They become quieter. They step back. And loud groups grow louder. So, by the early 1920s, the Nazi Party had two engines running at the same time. A message designed to turn national pain into personal anger. A street presence designed to make them look strong and unstoppable. Now here's where the story gets suspenseful, because this is the moment you might assume it should end. In 1923, Germany hit another breaking point: economic collapse and political chaos. And the Nazis decided to gamble. They attempted a coup in Munich, what history remembers as the beer hall putsch. It failed. And on paper, this should have destroyed them. A failed putsch should end a political movement. Leaders should disappear. Supporters should scatter. But here's the twist that makes this story so disturbing. The failure didn't erase Hitler. It introduced him to the country. Because the trial that followed turned into a stage. Instead of being treated like an unimportant extremist, Hitler got national attention. Newspapers covered it. His name spread far beyond Munich. He presented himself not as a criminal, but as a man acting out of patriotism. And even though he was convicted, the punishment was not as crushing as many expected. He served time in prison, but he came out with something he didn't have before: fame. And a lesson. The lesson was simple, and it changed everything that came next. Trying to seize power by force was too risky. The smarter path was to take power through the system, step by step, until the system couldn't stop you. So after prison, the Nazi Party didn't disappear. It reorganized. Hitler rebuilt it with a stricter structure, clearer messaging, and a strategy aimed at legitimacy. They expanded local chapters, targeted different groups of voters, and kept refining propaganda. And Hitler's public image shifted from street agitator to national leader in waiting. Then the Great Depression hit in 1929. And this is the moment the small movement became a mass movement. Because economic collapse doesn't just produce poverty, it produces fear. It produces rage. It produces humiliation. And it makes people desperate for certainty. Unemployment exploded. Families broke. Businesses collapsed. People who had never cared about politics suddenly cared because politics felt like survival. And in that environment, Hitler's message landed harder than ever. He promised restoration, strength, pride, order, work, a future that wasn't random, and, just as important, he promised a clear explanation for why life felt broken. That explanation was full of scapegoats and conspiracy thinking, dangerous, false, and destructive, but it was emotionally satisfying for people who felt powerless. And while moderate politicians argued and failed to stabilize the country, the Nazis looked like the only ones who had energy, discipline, and a plan. Here's the measurable proof that the movement had arrived. Elections. In the late 1920s, the Nazis were still a smaller force nationally. But after the Depression, their vote share jumped dramatically. By 1932, they became the largest party in the Reichstag, not because most Germans were Nazis, but because the political center collapsed and people split toward extremes. That's the real pattern. When the middle can't solve the crisis, the extremes sell certainty. So the movement grew through a sequence you can trace. Crisis creates desperation. Desperation makes simple narratives attractive. Propaganda builds identity and belonging. Intimidation weakens opposition. Elections turn loud into legitimate. And now we're at the most dangerous point in the whole story. Because once a movement becomes the largest political force, the next step doesn't look like a revolution. It looks like a deal. A few powerful people start thinking, we can use him. They start believing they can control him. They start treating him like a tool. And that's how the door opens. Next, we follow the moment where politics stops being a street fight and becomes a decision made behind closed doors. How Hitler goes from leading a movement to being handed real state power. So here's where the story turns from rallies and elections into something far more dangerous. The moment power is handed over legally. Because Hitler doesn't take Germany by storming a palace. He gets in through a door that influential people open themselves, while believing they can shut it later. By 1932, Germany is in political deadlock. The economy is crushed by the Depression. Unemployment is massive. Governments keep collapsing, and people are voting in desperation, not loyalty. That year, Hitler runs for president against Paul von Hindenburg, the old war hero who represents the traditional German establishment. Hitler loses, but the election does something important. It proves he's not just a street agitator anymore. He's a national figure with millions of supporters. Then, the parliamentary situation gets worse. In 1932, Germany holds major elections, and the Nazis become the largest party in the Reichstag. Not a majority, but the biggest bloc. That difference matters, because it creates a dilemma no one can ignore. You can't govern normally if the largest party refuses to cooperate, and the rest of the parties can't agree on anything. Germany starts sliding into government by emergency. The constitution allowed the president to appoint chancellors and rule by decree when parliament couldn't function. On paper, it sounds like a temporary solution. In reality, it becomes a shortcut around democracy. Chancellors come and go. Behind the scenes, the political elite, conservatives, old guard nationalists, wealthy industrial circles, are terrified of communism, terrified of chaos, and losing confidence in the democratic center. And this is where the door begins to open, because they start thinking in a very dangerous way. Not, how do we stop him? But, how do we use him? Hitler wants one thing now, the chancellorship, the position that controls government day to day. But Hindenburg hates the idea. He doesn't trust Hitler. He views him as a radical. For months, Hindenburg refuses to appoint him. So Hitler's party applies pressure the only way it can. It keeps winning votes, blocking coalitions, and making Germany harder to govern without them. The country is stuck. This is the moment many viewers misunderstand. They think Hitler forced his way in. What actually happens is colder. A group of powerful people decide that giving Hitler a title is the price of stability. One of the key figures here is Franz von Papen, a conservative politician who briefly served as chancellor in 1932. Papen believes something that later looks insane in hindsight. He believes Hitler can be controlled. He imagines a deal where Hitler gets the top job, but conservatives keep the real power behind him. Papen starts negotiating. Not with the public, not with the voters, behind closed doors. The plan is basically this: appoint Hitler as chancellor, surround him with conservative ministers, and box him in. Papen even expects to be the one pulling strings as vice-chancellor, controlling access to the president. It's a political fantasy. But in early 1933, it sounds reasonable to men who are desperate to end paralysis. And that's how the final push happens. On January 30th, 1933, Hindenburg appoints Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. That date is one of the most important in modern history, because it's not the day a war begins, it's not the day a dictatorship is officially declared, it's the day a radical movement crosses a line, from political force to state power. And here's the detail that makes the story even more unsettling. At the start, the Nazi Party does not control the whole government. In the initial cabinet, only a few key positions are held by Nazis. But they get the positions that matter most for control: the interior, which influences police power, and propaganda machinery that shapes public perception. Meanwhile, conservatives tell themselves, "See, we're safe. We're managing this." This is where the suspense is real, because from the outside, it can look almost normal. A new chancellor is appointed, there are speeches, there's ceremony. There's no immediate apocalypse on day one. Many ordinary people continue their routines. Many elites reassure themselves it's temporary. But power doesn't need to feel dramatic to become irreversible. Once you are chancellor, You have access to state resources. You influence police. You influence media. You influence the legal system's direction. You can call elections. You can shape narratives. You can redefine what security means. So the question becomes, what does Hitler do first? Not years later, not eventually, immediately. Because in this kind of story, the first moves matter most. They decide whether the system can still defend itself. And Hitler understands something his opponents keep ignoring. If you want long-term control, you don't start by announcing tyranny. You start by making your actions look like protection, like emergency management, like restoring order. That's what makes the door-opening moment so deadly. He doesn't need to break the law right away. He just needs the right crisis, at the right time, with the right fear. And Germany is already full of fear. So now he's inside the government. The movement is no longer outside shouting at the system, it's inside holding the pen. Next, we follow the moment the door doesn't just open, it starts to close behind everyone else. How emergency, fear, and legal changes were used to turn a chancellorship into a trap. Now that Hitler is inside the government, the story stops being about winning people over and becomes about locking everyone else out. And it happens faster than most people expect, because the first goal isn't to look like a dictator. The first goal is to look like the only person who can restore order. Just weeks after Hitler becomes chancellor, Germany gets the kind of crisis that changes everything. On February 27, 1933, the Reichstag building, Germany's parliament, goes up in flames. The fire becomes front-page shock, the kind that makes ordinary people feel unsafe overnight. And in moments like that, the public doesn't ask for long debates, they ask for protection. This is the trap. Fear creates permission. The next day, Hitler's government pushes through an emergency order often referred to as the Reichstag Fire Decree. The official framing is national security. The real effect is massive. Key civil liberties are suspended. Limits on police power weaken, searches and arrests become easier, and political opponents can be targeted under the language of public safety. And that's exactly what happens. Communists are arrested in large numbers, but the crackdown doesn't stop there. It becomes a message to anyone who might resist. The state is now watching, and it's willing to act. Then comes the election, March 5, 1933. What makes this election important isn't just the result, it's the environment. With opposition intimidated, with propaganda pushing fear, with police power expanded, the election is no longer a normal contest. The Nazis still don't win an absolute majority on their own, but they do win enough, especially with allies, to move to the next step. And here's the next step that closes the trap. The Enabling Act, passed on March 23, 1933. On paper, it sounds bureaucratic. In reality, it is one of the most important legal turning points of the 20th century. The act allows Hitler's government to make laws without parliament, effectively moving legislative power into the executive. It's sold as a temporary emergency tool, but emergencies are addictive to power. To get it passed, the conditions around the vote matter. The atmosphere is not neutral. Opposition is under pressure. Some opponents are already arrested or blocked, and the presence of paramilitary forces around political life adds intimidation. The vote happens, and once the Enabling Act is secured, the system's ability to stop Hitler is almost gone. Now the consolidation becomes a process with a name: Gleichschaltung, often translated as coordination or bringing into line. It sounds administrative, almost harmless, but it means forcing institutions to align with Nazi control. It starts with the obvious targets: regional governments and civil service. Officials who won't cooperate are removed. Bureaucracies are reshaped, so loyalty matters more than competence. Then it moves into daily life. Organizations, clubs, professional groups, spaces where independent social power exists. The point is simple. If people can gather, organize, or speak outside the state's control, that's a threat. Independent voices get squeezed out, step by step. Political parties are next. As 1933 continues, Germany becomes a one-party state. Opposition parties are banned or forced to dissolve themselves. What used to be a noisy democracy becomes a controlled environment where disagreement is treated as danger. Meanwhile, propaganda becomes constant and professional. This isn't random hype, it's state-level messaging designed to shape what people believe is normal. When you control the story people hear every day, reality becomes easier to bend. But even after all of this, Hitler still has a problem. His movement contains different factions. The SA, big, aggressive, street power muscle, wants more radical change. Conservative elites and the army are nervous about the SA's size and violence. Hitler needs the army. He needs stability. He needs powerful institutions to obey him without hesitation. So he makes another cold decision. In June 1934, during what's known as the Night of the Long Knives, Hitler orders a purge, targeting SA leadership and other perceived threats. This is not just internal party drama. It sends a clear signal to the entire country. There is no safe opposition, not even inside the movement. And crucially, it reassures the army and conservative power centers that Hitler is willing to eliminate instability when it threatens his control. That helps him secure their cooperation. Then comes the final lock on the door. In August 1934, President Hindenburg dies. Instead of allowing the presidency to pass normally, Hitler merges the roles, combining head of state and head of government. The army is required to swear an oath of loyalty, not to a constitution, but to Hitler personally. That's not a symbolic detail. That's the state transforming into personal rule. At this point, the trap is closed. What began as a chancellorship, given through political deals, has become a dictatorship through emergency powers, legal restructuring, intimidation, propaganda, and the removal of rivals. Not one dramatic coup, but a chain of moves that each looked justified in the moment. And the darkest part is this. Many people realize what happened only after it's too late to reverse. Now we need to look at the cost, because once the system is captured, the decisions that follow don't stay inside Germany. They expand outward, and the consequences become global. That's next. Once the trap closes, the story stops being about politics. It becomes about people who no longer have protection. Because when one man and one party control the police, the courts, the press, and the laws, the question isn't who will win the next election. The question becomes who gets to count as a full human being and who doesn't. And that shift doesn't arrive with one giant announcement. It arrives through decisions that look administrative on paper. New rules, new categories, new punishments, new exceptions. The kind of things most ordinary people don't track day to day, especially when they're tired, busy, or trying to protect their family. That's how the cost spreads quietly at first. Opposition is crushed. Independent media disappears. Public life becomes dangerous. People learn to speak differently, even in their own homes. Neighbors become careful around neighbors. Friends stop trusting friends. Not because everyone suddenly changes, but because fear changes how people behave. And the most devastating part is how the regime directs that fear. It doesn't say, life is hard because the system failed. It says, life is hard because they exist. That's the moment a society becomes capable of cruelty it would have rejected just a few years earlier. This is also where the propaganda machine shows its true power. Not just to persuade, but to normalize. To make the unthinkable feel like policy. To make hatred feel like responsibility. To make silence feel like safety. And then the violence expands. Persecution escalates. Rights vanish for targeted groups. Families are broken. Lives are destroyed on purpose. The result is one of the darkest crimes in human history, the Holocaust, an industrial-scale genocide planned and executed through bureaucracy, logistics, and dehumanization. And it matters to say it clearly. This wasn't an accident of war. It was a choice. Then comes the outward explosion. Once a dictatorship is stable at home, it looks outward. Because internal control creates a belief in unstoppable momentum. And Hitler's state doesn't just want order, it wants expansion. In the 1930s, Germany begins tearing up the post-World War I limits. Rearmament accelerates. The regime tests the world's response. It pushes, watches, pushes again. Each step is framed as correction, justice, national pride, and the world hesitates. That hesitation becomes part of the story too, because it shows how dangerous gradual escalation is. When change happens in small steps, people argue about each step instead of seeing the direction. Then the steps stop being small. In 1939, Germany invades Poland. World War II begins. And once the war starts, it becomes a machine that eats everything. Cities, economies, families, entire generations. Tens of millions die. Countries are destroyed. The scale of suffering becomes almost impossible to hold in one mind. Eventually, the momentum breaks. Germany opens multiple fronts. Resources stretch. Losses compound. The war turns, and the regime's control turns even more desperate. The dictatorship that was built through fear begins to survive through fear. By 1944 and 1945, Germany is collapsing under the weight of what it started. Allied forces advance. Cities are devastated. Supply lines break. The leadership retreats into denial. And then comes the final image people remember, because it feels like a movie, but it's real. Hitler in a bunker under Berlin, refusing to accept reality, surrounded by the consequences of his decisions. The same man who rose by promising control ends in a room where control is gone. In April 1945, Hitler dies by suicide. Days later, Germany surrenders in May. That's the collapse. But the story doesn't end there, because aftermath is part of the cost. Germany is ruined. Millions are displaced. Survivors carry trauma for life. Europe is reshaped. The world confronts crimes that force a new language for evil. Trials follow, like Nuremberg, trying to establish accountability, to document what happened, and to set a precedent that following orders is not a moral escape. Now, here's the warning takeaway, and I want to keep it calm, not loud, not motivational. The most dangerous lesson from this story is not history had a monster. The lesson is that modern societies can be steered into disaster through recognizable steps. When a population is exhausted, simple blame becomes attractive. When fear is constant, people trade rights for promises. When institutions weaken, personalities grow. When propaganda becomes normal, reality becomes negotiable. When one group is treated as less human, cruelty becomes policy. That's why this story matters. Not to shock you, not to entertain you. To remind you that the beginning of collapse often looks like a reasonable response to crisis. And if you stayed with this until the end, I want to say something directly. Videos like this take serious time, research, structuring, and writing in a way that's clear, responsible, and engaging without glorifying anything. So if you found this valuable, please support the channel. Like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone who cares about understanding how power really works. And comment one thing that surprised you, one moment where you thought, wait, that's how it started? Because the algorithm pushes what people engage with, and your support is what allows me to keep making long, documentary-style biographies that are worth your time. All right, thanks for listening. And in the next video, we'll look at another life, another rise, another fall, and the hidden pattern people miss until it's too late. End.